Ukrainian Catholic Church in the Eparchy of Toronto in Eastern Canada. He served as Canada's first ambassador for religious freedom and head of the Office of Religious Freedom from 2013 to 2016. And at the same time, he served as Canada's head of delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is a 31-country body which leads international efforts in Holocaust education and research. Deacon Andrew holds a PhD in politics from the University of Edinburgh, as well as degrees in history from other universities. We'll leave the fishing analogies for later, Father Deacon, if that's okay. Next, immediately to my left is Nathaniel Hurd, who serves as the director of the North America Action Team and senior fellow at the Public Policy for Religious Freedom Institute. Prior to working at RFI, he worked as a senior policy advisor to the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the U.S. Helsinki Commission. His work for the Commission as a nonpartisan staffer focused on religious freedom, including the United States humanitarian crises, the Holy See, atrocity crimes such as genocide and others. In addition to advising senators and representatives from both parties, he drafted legislation that entered into law, conceptualized and directed hearings, advocated for religious prisoners, monitored elections in Europe, and represented the United States with foreign government officials and parliamentarians, faith communities, journalists, and international institutions such as the United Nations and the World Food Bank. To my right, Zorzi, who serves as the Director of Advocacy for Global Religious Freedom with ADF International. She leads efforts to address and counter global persecution against Christians and other religious minorities. Based in Washington, D.C., Zorzi engages with a multinational network of attorneys, government officials, and international bodies to coordinate efforts aimed at challenging legal barriers to religious freedom and asserting religious freedom as the foundation to the international human rights framework. In 2018, she was elected president of the United Nations NGO Committee on Freedom of Religion or Belief. Zorzi earned her JD at George Washington University Law School, where she also participated in the GW Oxford International Human Rights Law Program and is very prestigiously graduated from there. Finally, to my far right, Stephen Rasche is the Vice Chancellor of the Catholic University in Erbil in Iraq, where he also serves as the Executive Director of the Institute for Ancient and Threatened Christianity. Mr. Rasche has over 35 years of experience in international business and aid development projects, including extensive work in Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. In 2014, Mr. Rasche left his commercial practice and entered full-time work in support of humanitarian crises in northern Iraq created by the ISIS conflict. He served as an official representative to the Vatican Dicastery on Refugees and Migrants, and also serves as an official member to the Historical Commission to the Vatican Postulator in the cause of Father Rashid Ghani and 3 murdered Iraqi deacons. Author of numerous articles on the subject of Iraq and religious minorities, he's been published and interviewed in leading media outlets worldwide. So ladies and gentlemen, here are panelists, and I would invite Nathaniel to open up our conversation this afternoon.
Great. Thank you, Father. It's a delight to be here at Notre Dame. It's particularly a delight to be on a panel made up of all of my friends, including Father Deacon. Father Deacon and I have known each other since 1997. I was a young study abroad student at the University of Edinburgh. He was a PhD student. I had a full head of hair and was an atheist. A lot has changed since then. I'm going to try and whip through as quickly as possible several propositions today. I'm only going to be able to touch on them very briefly, and hopefully we'll be able to probe them a bit during the discussion period, and then hopefully with some of you afterwards. Sometimes, whether it is in the world of advocacy or in particular the world of public policy, especially in Washington, there is often a claim or at least a practice of a separation between religious freedom in the United States and the promotion of religious freedom internationally. And I would put it to you today that what the United States does internationally to promote religious freedom is grounded in how we understand it here in the United States. Those famous and beautiful words of the Declaration of Independence, inalienable rights, which of course were enumerated in particular in the Bill of Rights, including, of course, first and foremost, religious freedom. Inalienable rights, not just for people in the United States, but for people everywhere. We advocate for religious freedom. We fight for religious freedom overseas because it is inalienable to them and to us. To the extent that we do it, it can have life-changing, life-saving effects in other parts of the world. To the effect that we don't, I would argue it is a threat to religious freedom. And so I want to just go through very briefly some domestic religious freedom things, which I think have with international implications. I want to start with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. I was going through the legislative history there, and it was really quite extraordinary. And one of the reasons that I thought it was important to sort of start there was to show, first of all, how the most important international religious freedom piece of legislation that's ever been passed, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, followed this not just in chronology, but very much in spirit and energy as well. And to also underscore that there was a time in the United States when, at least at the public policy level, there was unanimity between Democrats and Republicans, between people across the political and philosophical spectrum on religious freedom. And I think the 90s, to some extent, were sort of a high watermark there. So RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act for short, was originally introduced in 1990 on the House of Representatives side by a Democrat from New York and by then Senator Joe Biden from Delaware. So those were the two who were spearheading it to begin with. It didn't pass that Congress. It was reintroduced in 1991 by the same representative, and then on the Senate side by Senator Ted Kennedy, not exactly known as a political conservative. Didn't pass, reintroduced in 1993. By that point, then Representative Chuck Schumer introduced it on the House side, and Senator Kennedy reintroduced it on the Senate side. There were on the House side 170 co-sponsors. As a former congressional staffer who has spent a lot of time asking other offices to co-sponsor legislation, that is a remarkable number for any bill. Those co-sponsors included future Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and future Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer. There was one independent who also co-sponsored then Representative Bernie Sanders from my home state of Vermont. It passed the House unanimously, and the Senate then passed the House version 97-3, and President Clinton signed it into law. The supportive organizations included the ACLU and the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. And I had a chance to go back and look at President Clinton's remarks recently at the signing ceremony, and it was a beautiful explication of why religious freedom has always been important to America. Really worth taking a look at if you get the chance. There then were a series of state RFRAs that were passed, including by the states that were the chambers in both the upper house and the lower house were totally controlled by Democrats: Connecticut, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Rhode Island. There are other ways of sort of slicing and dicing this, but it's simply to say that there was objectively bipartisanship on this. Then we get to the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, introduced by a great champion of religious freedom, both domestically and internationally, former Congressman Frank Wolf from Virginia. He introduced it with 17 Republicans and 8 Democrats, including, again, future Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. It eventually passed the House 375-41, which is a pretty healthy margin, and the Senate passed it unanimously, 98-0, and then President Clinton signed it into law. So clearly, both on the domestic side and on the international side, there was a great deal of energy and agreement on religious freedom. One of the challenges in the international space has been at the bureaucratic level. You can have the best possible legislation, but if it's not being faithfully implemented by the executive branch, that has real consequences for people on the ground. And as I noted earlier, usually civil society is in the cutting edge of these things, and then to some degree Congress catches up, and then eventually the executive branch catches up as well. The executive branch usually balks at things like the International Religious Freedom Act. First of all, they don't like Congress telling them to do anything when it comes to foreign policy. Secondly, this argument has been made over the years that, well, we have this sort of panoply of rights and they're all sort of at the same level. And, a piece of legislation, for example, that creates an office dedicated to international religious freedom or dedicated to monitoring and combating anti-Semitism or dedicated to combating human trafficking, you're sort of creating this hierarchy of rights. The reason that Congress develops and passes these laws is because of a perception that the executive branch is not paying sufficient attention to these subjects. And it was sort of with that in mind that I was very struck by the remarks of Secretary of State Tony Blinken when he was introducing the 2020 International Religious Freedom Report. So it started off beautifully. Religious freedom is a human right. It goes to the heart of what it means to be human, to think freely, to follow our conscience, to change our beliefs if our hearts and minds lead us to do so, to express these beliefs in public and private. Beautiful. Then he goes on, though, to say that religious freedom is co-equal with other human rights because human rights are indivisible. It's not more or less important. And on its face, you might think, well, that doesn't look so objectionable. This is exactly the kind of language that bureaucrats in the executive branch have typically used when they're trying to de-emphasize religious freedom overseas. One just very quick point that I'll make, because I know that we're running short on time. Why is it that people like President Biden on the campaign trail disavowed being supportive of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act? Why has there been a fraying of this degree of consensus that we saw in the 1990s? And there are many different reasons for that. One of the maxims that we have at the Religious Freedom Institute is that religious freedom is important because religion is important. And to the extent that people are skeptical about religious freedom, I would argue it's because they've become increasingly skeptical about religion, and they're skeptical about religion because of religious people, because of what they've sort of seen and perceived from religious people, to the extent that there is a belief that either an official or members of the public have that faith, that religion, that religious people and institutions are antithetical to freedom, to happiness, to human flourishing, contrary to the good and the true and the beautiful. It will affect how they see religious freedom. And I would also argue that one other thing, it was sort of discussed a little bit in the opening panel today, but one of the most contentious matters in the United States today is what people think about male and female, about human sexuality, about marriage, and about family. And when you look at sort of the prevailing views on that subject through all the cultural institutions and culture shaping institutions that Cardinal Dolan mentioned today, by and large, they're dominated by people who adhere to a certain understanding of human sexuality, male and female, et cetera. Sexual orientation and gender identity ideology would maybe be another way of putting it. And the people who are sort of saying no to that are, by and large, religious people and religious institutions. And it has implications for how religious freedom is understood here in the United States, and therefore how it is understood overseas. If you look at the proliferation of lawsuits that have targeted religious people and institutions, if you look at legal action that religious people and institutions have had to file themselves to protect themselves from the state or from others, often, not always, but often, it has to do with these questions about male and female, human sexuality, fundamental questions about human nature. And to the extent that people think that religion and religious freedom is a threat to their claims and sort of these claims being put into practice, it has led to a conclusion that religion should primarily be privatized, and and to the extent that it's public, it should primarily be about worship. And what that means is that when you have diplomats in the field in the United States who are being sort of driven by what's happening domestically, to the extent that the message they're getting from back home is faith is something that should be private, it should be perhaps worship, but it should not be lived fully and publicly, particularly when it conflicts with some of these claims that are being made about the human person, about human nature, male and female, et cetera. It will mean that those diplomats are not fighting for religious freedom in sort of the full scope, the full sense, which in turn is very much a threat to religious freedom abroad, as the United States is still the world's only superpower. So I'll stop there. I know there's a lot there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. Ms. Zorzi?
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you among many friends, and we're so grateful to Notre Dame Law School for putting on this very important event, and look forward to the future summits as well. I'm going to be focusing my remarks today on religious freedom at the United Nations. I've actually been working on this issue at the United Nations since 2014. And I spent from 2014 through the end of 2019 on the ground at the UN in New York, day in and day out, working with diplomats on this issue, working on resolutions. I'm currently based in DC and also working on quite a bit of litigation with lawyers around the world, primarily in countries including Pakistan, Nigeria, China, and a few other countries in the Middle East. And my focus right now in my work is really the most basic, fundamental, foundational rights that pertain to religious freedom. So we're talking about the right to choose your religion and the right to change your religion and the right to talk about your beliefs and to share them with others. And then, of course, the right to worship in community. And one nice thing is that here in the United States, no one really disagrees with the importance of these very foundational aspects of religious freedom. These are not partisan issues here in the US, but this actually is not true at the United Nations. When I first arrived at the UN in New York in 2014, I was discouraged to find that the issue of religious freedom was really at an impasse, a complete impasse. And we were seeing this in very concrete ways. There's a resolution at the UN that's brought every year in the General Assembly in the fall on the freedom of religion or belief. It's brought by the EU, it's tabled by the EU, and they facilitate the negotiation. There's another resolution called Combating Intolerance. That's tabled by the OIC, which is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And these two resolutions are viewed as sort of going hand in hand. And they kind of, they reveal one of the greatest fights when it comes to religious freedom at the United Nations. So the EU resolution is really focused on the rights of individuals to do those things that I mentioned, to choose their faith and to worship. And the OIC resolution on combating intolerance is more so focused on a religion's right to be free from defamation. And so it's really a foundational difference in terms of what does religious freedom mean? Is it to protect individuals, or is it to protect religions from slander and from being placed in a non-privileged position in society? And so we've watched this impasse play out not only in the GA resolutions, but we've watched even at the Security Council level. It's very difficult to get anything through, even on some of the most egregious issues such as genocide. I was very involved in the UN Security Resolution that was passed in 2017, condemning the ISIS genocide in Iraq. And at that time, we were very hopeful that the resolution would also condemn the atrocities occurring in Syria. But because state actors were involved in some of those atrocities, Russia's veto power and Russia's relationship with Syria prevented anything along the lines of Syria and the genocide from even being considered. And we're seeing that right now when it comes to the genocide of Uyghur Muslims in China. With China having veto power at the Security Council, it's sort of just like a non-starter to even really get much done on that issue at the United Nations. And so I think a lot of people have also been watching this impasse and some of the frustrations, and they really do start asking, is the UN doing anything to advance religious freedom? And it's an open question, but what I can say is that some things are being done to sort of get around the standstill. And I think the biggest thing that a lot of countries are trying is to not focus on religious freedom per se, but to instead focus on other related rights. We saw this with the US mission to the United Nations in 2019. At the time, they had said that religious freedom was their number one human rights priority for that General Assembly in 2019. But they didn't feel that politically they could bring a resolution on religious freedom. And so instead, they brought a resolution on the right to assembly and association, which obviously is critical for religious freedom, but they were kind of trying to get around some of the issues that we're seeing at the UN by focusing on something a bit more specific. We're seeing this right now. The UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief is writing a report that will be presented at the GA in the fall. And it's not on religious freedom per se, it's on the freedom of thought, which is obviously very important to religious freedom, but in some senses separate as well. And we see other groups sort of trying to bring up the issue of religious freedom at the UN, not as a standalone issue, but as a cross-cutting issue, which is the term that's always used at the UN. So if you're talking about women's rights or the rights of indigenous people or children, maybe trying to get it in there rather than focusing on it as a standalone issue. Another strategy that's taking place, and it doesn't really bode well for the UN itself, but is that other multilateral groups are being created, and the issue is in some ways being outsourced to many of these other groups. And so in 2016, Canada and the US came together and they created what's called the International Contact Group on Religious Freedom, and had about 25 countries meeting regularly to discuss religious freedom. Ironically, the meetings were all held at the United Nations, but this is not something that was didn't have United Nations branding, and the United Nations didn't own this group. And so it was a way to sort of get around some of the obstacles, but still have the discussion in a multilateral forum. Then in 2018, the US government decided to create what's called the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom. And it's the largest gathering of government officials and civil society members and church leaders and everyone working on this issue. And I think on a lot of other human rights issues, governments would have gone to the UN to host this type of conference because of its magnitude. But because, like I said, the many obstacles around this issue at the UN, the US said, we're going to start this ourselves. We will host it. They hosted the first 2 years. Last year, Poland hosted. This year, Brazil was supposed to host, but they pulled out because of the pandemic. It will be in the UK next year, but just another example of sort of outsourcing this issue to other groups. And then, of course, most recently in 2019, then Secretary Pompeo created what is called the IRFBA, the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, similar to the contact group that I mentioned, but it's really a meeting of government officials at a higher level, so at a minister's level, Secretary of State level, and they meet every month. It's a group of 32 countries, and it's growing to talk about issues of religious freedom and to discuss what they can do to advance the cause. There's a council of experts that helps to inform the IRFBA's agenda. I sit on that council of experts. We actually had a meeting this morning, and some very good things are underway with that group, and they're trying to really have an impact in a way that the UN really hasn't been able to have historically. Despite some of these positive developments and trying to get around this impasse at the UN, we do have a number of concerns. We're seeing both in some remaining processes at the UN and other multilateral groups such as the IRFA. More and more we're seeing what is being pursued is basically like the lowest hanging fruit. And I'll give you some examples. This alliance of 32 countries is focused in large part on apostasy and blasphemy laws, two things that my team is also very focused on. But rather than having the stated goal of decriminalizing apostasy and blasphemy, the stated goal is just to remove the death penalty as a punishment, which is of course vitally important, but the death penalty is rarely carried out anyway. And so, we would like to see sometimes some more ambitious goals at the outset, rather than trying to only rally around things that many people would agree with anyway. We're seeing at the UN, there's much more of an appetite to talk about religious freedom if it's surrounding violence carried out against religious groups. So that's sort of an appropriate time to talk about religious freedom. But if violence is not a component, there's not much of an appetite. And like I said, these things violence and death penalty, of course, are critically important and need to be addressed. No one's disputing that. But surely religious freedom means much more than just being free from physical violence or than just being free from the death penalty. And so we would really like to see a more robust advocacy around some of these issues. And another concern we're seeing popping up more and more is this trend to sort of redefine religious freedom to include the issue of the ways in which religion can harm other human rights. And we're seeing this again and again. So in a number of religious freedom reports that have been released by the UN recently, the focus is not so much on the rights of individuals to freely carry out their religion, but rather the ways in which religious groups interfere with a woman's right to what they're calling reproductive rights, or other social issues, and how religious groups are interfering with these other so-called rights. And so we're definitely seeing that as an obstacle as well. Sure.
No, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe I was over time, which would have been fine.
But that's okay.
I'll definitely wrap it up. The final thing that we're seeing, which is a concern, is the fact that the countries that are promoting religious freedom are, in a sense, seeming to give up on protecting the freedom of speech. And so while they're saying they want religious freedom for minorities, they also want these very robust hate speech laws, and they're pushing for them in various ways at the UN right now. In a lot of the cases I work on in countries like Turkey or Algeria or Egypt, speech is a major way in which governments are criminalizing the activity of religious minorities. And so without robust speech protections, we're not sure what version of religious freedom is really being promoted. So I'll just wrap up on a very positive note, which is that we've seen a major increase in infrastructure on this issue, sort of outside of the UN, but we're able to kind of work with and through these new groups that have formed. There have been hundreds of working groups around the world, not hundreds, dozens of working groups around the world on this issue in countries where you wouldn't expect them. Some of the countries where the persecution is the worst. We're seeing a gap being filled when it comes to legal advocacy for persecution in some of these countries. And we're very thankful for Notre Dame to be taking the lead on this initiative, especially coming out of the law school. We hope that it will continue to fill some of these legal gaps when it comes to persecution. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ms. Zorzi. Sorry to cut you off.
No worries.
My apologies. We have try to leave a little bit of time for questions later. Mr. Rasche.
Thank you, Father. First off, thanks to Notre Dame for having us here on behalf of our young university in northern Iraq, the Catholic University in Erbil. We're quite honored to be here. So thanks for having us. My main topic is the status of religious liberty in the Middle East. It seems really almost an absurd topic to talk about. There is not religious liberty in the Middle East. So you need to be real about where you can move the needle on this subject. The reality is that in most of the Middle East, including Iraq, you have one religion, which is the state religion. In the case of Iraq, it's Islam, and the basis of all law is Sharia, and that's enshrined right at the beginning of their constitution. So where you go from there for religious liberty for any other faith, you can see it's obviously a difficult path, especially for the case of the religious minorities in Iraq. That would be the Christians, the Mandaein, the Kakai, and of course the Yazidis. So you have these sort of structural power imbalances existing in much of the Middle East, these institutionally structured power imbalances. But these lessons are not just for the Middle East, because we see this happening in other places in the world, certainly the situation with the Uyghurs in China, which is getting the attention it deserves, at least at this conference. So within that situation, where do you go with religious liberty as you'd like to see it begin to progress in some of these countries, and what will happen without it? In Iraq, the current constitution, as I've mentioned, enshrines Islam and Sharia within the very words of their constitution. An interesting sidelight to that is that constitution was put into place while the United States of America essentially controlled everything in Iraq. It's a question, I think, for scholars to examine. How did that happen? How did that happen that we went and invaded a country with the intended purpose of rebuilding it as a member of the modern group of nations, and yet we punted on that right away? It's not, we don't have the time or the space to get into that here, but certainly it's a question that deserves to be asked, because much of the problem we're facing now in Iraq stems from the existence of this constitutionally structured taking of liberty from people. And on one small glimmer of hope is that the Iraqi people themselves, having lived under this constitution now for nearly 20 years, have come to realize how harmful it is even to them. For the people that followed the Iraq protest movements, which began in earnest in the year before COVID, one of the things that the young Iraqi people were marching and being killed for in the streets for nearly a year was an end to the present constitution. They get rid of it and replace it with a constitution in which no state religion was enshrined. And the leaders of that movement are not Iraqi Christians, they're young Iraqi Shia Muslims who have seen how harmful that structure has been to them, and how much of a preventative it's been for their ability to move and join the world of responsible nations. So I think that if you're going to look at the Middle East, if you're going to look at a canary in the coal mine, pay attention to what happens in the upcoming elections in Iraq. They're currently scheduled to take place now in October, and this issue of whether or not new thinking can come into place, which can affect these structural imbalances. That's an area to watch for, and to watch for quite closely. It's not 100% sure whether or not those elections will actually take place, or whether or not they'll be postponed, but it's a thing that bears watching. There perhaps is some real hope for Iraq that may come out of these elections, at least the beginning of hope that can come out of these elections. And that may be something that can be looked at as a model going on down the road. But as it exists right now in most of the Middle East, there is not religious liberty, and people should not be confused about that. There are varying forms of tolerance which exist depending upon the political necessities and pressures that are being placed upon the host countries at any given time. And that gets me to the other subject, which one of the main takeaways that I've had in these years working on the ground in Iraq and trying to figure out how is it that the West continually gets everything so wrong when it comes to these countries. And really, we get it wrong almost 100% of the time. It's really difficult to see where we've gotten it right on any sustained basis. There have been glimpses of good efforts that had potential, but the constantly changing nature of our political system, in which every time there's a new administration, we do a complete reset, forgetting that there are living, breathing human beings at the end of those policy resets in the rest of the world. And that's certainly true in a country like Iraq, where the US continues to have a huge sway. And now we've just gone through an enormous swing again. We went from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, and now back to, in many ways, the Obama administration, with some potential changes. We're waiting to see on that. We have some hope that some lessons have been learned there. But again, the people on the ground try to figure out what is happening here. Which way is the wind blowing? Are forces going to be unleashed, which wipe us out again? And these things are driven in large part by Western policy decisions, in which our policy goes this direction for 4 years and then that direction for 4 years, and leaving aside the merits of either policy. It's simply the swing, the violent swings that catches the people in the middle. And one of the things that really became clear to me in all of this was our unwillingness to address the truth of what is really happening on the ground for these people. And Kelsey touched on this a little bit in some of the things that they come up against when you're trying to frame a discussion within the UN structure. And they've got certain overall policies that they want to promote. Well, these policies are Western-driven policies. And in many cases, they're policies which don't take into account the actual situation of the people on the ground. And I'll give one quick example on this. Maybe we'll have time to come back to it. In Iraq right now, and in much of the Middle East, there's the big push from the West, and it's a well-meaning push, is for things that we would call peace building, or interreligious dialogue, or interfaith dialogue. And these are things that are priorities for us. And I'm not trying to suggest that they are not things that should, or that they are things that should not be priorities. But for the people on the ground, for the victims of actual genocide in Iraq, whether they're Yazidis or Christians or whomever, when you speak to them about the necessity as a matter of first course to begin interfaith dialogue and peace building efforts, they look at you as people who are comfortable people speaking from a first world position. And this is just uniform. When you speak with the actual people and give them an opportunity to speak on their own behalf, they'll look at you and say, look, we are victims of an actual genocide. We lost everything we had. We lost everything we owned. We lost people. We lost our homes. We lost our livelihoods. We lost years of our life. What we want is security, food, and housing. If you want us to forgive the people who oppressed us, fine. We'll forgive them. In the case of the Christians, they will tell you our faith compels us to do so, and so they forgive them. But when we come and say, okay, now the next priority for you should be peace building and interfaith dialogue, they have stopped listening to you. They have stopped listening to you. And to the extent that they are still listening to you, it's out of politeness. And this is a thing we need to understand. We need to understand this, especially when we are developing our aid policies to go in and quote unquote fix these problems or help these problems or help them become mitigated. We need to start from the reality of what happened there. And this is not just in Iraq. It happens all around the world. And this is what the strongest message I think that I could give. The one thing that I learned 6 years on the ground with the Iraqis, with the Christian and Yazidi minorities throughout the war, is this huge gulf that exists between the truth of their reality and what actually happened to them versus what we think they need, and understanding, having a little bit perhaps more humility than we do have presently, and understand that these aspirational goals that we have, which are valid, and the aspirations are well-intended and well-meaning, but we should understand how aspirational they are, meanwhile ensuring that the people are not unaffected or untouched by any of the improvements which we think we're bringing. Security, food, housing, education. It's what the people, the religious minorities in these countries are concerned about when they're trying to recover, not firstly these aspirational things. And if we are going to speak seriously about these aspirational things, then we need to speak truthfully about the fact that we're addressing countries in which we can have all the aspiration for tolerance that we want. But if you're dealing with a country in which constitutionally the people are separated into classes, it's a difficult road to hoe. And we need to speak honestly about that. So it's a lot of issues to deal with. Hopefully we can have some questions on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rasche. Reverend Deacon.
Yes, thank you very much, Father. And it's good to be with you.
Just 1 second, we need your video. Sorry. That's our problem, not yours. There you are. If you could keep your remarks to around 10 minutes to leave us just a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Certainly. Well, thank you, Father. And I guess we're bookending this panel today with North America. And I just want to reaffirm what my good friend Nathaniel said about domestic religious freedom, is that if we don't have robust domestic religious freedom, it's very difficult to advance religious freedom internationally, especially when we stand by the view that religious freedom is an inalienable right and that it is both universal and objective. And further to what Steve Rasche said, when we're engaging countries that have gone through experiences like Iraq, like Syria, we have to understand that there is this objectivity and universality to religious freedom, and that behooves us to understand the situation on the ground. So I want to talk a little bit today about the situation in Canada. And it's good to have this engagement on U.S. religious freedom as well, because I want you to keep, I guess, one thing in mind. There's one thing you take away from my presentation. It's that the situation for religious freedom in Canada is really a bit of a canary in the coal mine for the United States. And the trends that we're seeing in the United States are more advanced in Canada. And I would say that we're probably about 5 years ahead of where you are in terms of how institutions are understanding religious freedom and how even individual citizens understand religious freedom. And I mean 5 years, not in a good way. So we're seeing some challenges to religious freedom in Canada. I want to talk about that today. So first of all, just a very brief bit of historical context for you for religious freedom in Canada. Religious freedom as a fundamental freedom is not actually enumerated in the Constitution until 1982, when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was brought into our Constitution in 1982. Unlike the United States, we follow a British model of constitution. So we have many different constitutional documents, including statutes and conventions that form our Constitution. So the 1982 Constitution Act, a large part of it is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But of course, although religious freedom is rooted there as the first freedom, similar to your First Amendment, this is in Section 2A of the Charter, religious freedom was certainly present in Canada in robust ways, and we certainly had it grounded within the common law, going right back to Magna Carta, of course, where Magna Carta first really articulates this understanding of religious freedom for the church vis-a-vis the crown. And so that's really the historical framework that we're operating in. The Constitution Act 1867, which gave birth to the modern Federation of Canada, the modern Dominion of Canada, it contains within it provisions for minority educational rights. So you remember that Canada, we have this interesting historical compact, some would argue, between English-speaking, at that time, largely Protestants, and French-speaking Catholics, and then certainly our First Nations and Indigenous people. So that Constitution Act of 1867 provided for the rights of the Crown's Roman Catholic subjects in Ontario to have religious education protected under the Constitution, and for the Crown's Protestant subjects in predominantly Catholic Quebec to have their system of Protestant education within the province. Also, unlike the United States, where the idea of religious liberty is really bound up in the founding of the country, with the idea of religious dissenters coming to America to find religious freedom, we think about the Mayflower Compact. The history in Canada is quite a bit different, because really religious dissent is not a driver for the colonies of British North America to come together. But what we find in another very important constitutional document, the Quebec Act of 1774, you'll remember that Quebec New France fell to the British in 1759, 1760. And the Quebec Act of 1774, for the first time in the British Empire, granted full civil rights to the Crown's Roman Catholic subjects. So something that British Roman Catholics did not enjoy for almost 80 years after that. So that's a very unique feature of religious freedom in Canada. Now, religious freedom jurisprudence in Canada has been defined very much, at least recent jurisprudence, has been defined very much by the Charter, really since 1985, and there are a number of key cases that helped to define how the Supreme Court of Canada and the courts generally interpret religious freedom. And the one that really sort of set the bar was the 1985 case, Regina versus Big M Drug Mart Limited. And Big M Drug Mart was a retail chain in Alberta that was charged with violating the Lord's Day Act by offering services on Sunday. And in its defense, the corporation challenged the act because it infringed on what they saw as their religious freedom. And in that case, the Supreme Court established a broad definition of religious freedom that set a precedent. And in that decision, it stated, freedom of religion is the right to entertain such religious beliefs as a person chooses, the right to declare religious beliefs openly and without fear of hindrance or reprisal, and the right to manifest belief by worship and practice or by teaching and dissemination. So very much in concert with broader understandings of religious freedom we find in international human rights law, for example, and certainly in American jurisprudence. However, in the last 5 years in Canada, we've seen somewhat of a narrowing of religious freedom to perhaps really understanding religious freedom merely as a freedom to worship. But even that has been challenged recently due to the pandemic. There are a number of key cases that we need to look to see this shift taking place. The most significant one would be the Trinity Western University versus the Law Society of Upper Canada, and the Law Society of British Columbia versus Trinity Western University. This landmark pair of cases came before the Supreme Court, dealing with an attempt by Trinity Western University, a conservative private Christian university in British Columbia, to establish a law school. And opposition soon emerged from those who believed that the university's community covenant, which was compulsory for all Trinity Western students and staff, and which prohibited sexual activity outside the scope of heterosexual marriage, was seen as being discriminatory to students that experience same-sex attraction. So in light of this opposition, the Law Society of British Columbia reversed an earlier decision to grant to accredit the school. The same thing with the Law Society of Upper Canada. And so in its decision, this moved up to the Supreme Court in June 2018. They issued a 7-2 decision that the law societies could refuse accreditation on the basis that Trinity Western's community members cannot impose those religious beliefs on fellow law students, since they have an inequitable impact and can cause significant harm. The court recognized that this is a profound interference in the university community's religious freedom, but that given the unequal access caused by the community covenant, it was justifiable. Another thing that has come about on the legislative side now in the province of Quebec is the secularism law of 2019, an act respecting the laicity of the state. This was enacted despite opposition from religious groups in Quebec, and also from the city of Montreal and from voices outside the rest of Canada. The law that has now been on the books for 2 years establishes 4 principles related to the laicity or the secular nature of the state: the separation of state and religion, the religious neutrality of the state, the equality of all citizens, and freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. However, with the express desire of enforcing a closed secularism in which the Quebec state has officially eliminated religious expressions from the halls of government and related bodies, this includes employees such as teachers, police officers, crown prosecutors, in which the wearing of outward religious symbols, such as the hijab, the turban for Orthodox Sikhs, the kippah, crosses for faithful Christians, these symbols have all been banned from the public square for public servants, which in a sense forces people to privatize their faith. So right now in Canada, we have, I would say, 2 key drivers that are impacting religious freedom, and I would say the attenuating of religious freedom within our society. The first one is an overall amnesia that exists, and there are 2 forms of this amnesia. The first is an amnesia that we're seeing within our institutions, and I've just given you 2 examples with the Supreme Court in the Trinity Western case and in the case of the government of Quebec and the secularism law, where there's a failure to understand that people cannot just privatize their faith, that religious freedom is fundamentally about a public faith. We're always free in our inner lives of faith, in the forum interna, as we might say in the Catholic tradition. But religious freedom is about the public living out of faith, not simply by worship, but also the freedom to speak about your faith, to engage in missionary activity if your faith calls you to that, to set up institutions that reflect the tenets of your faith. That's all bound up in religious freedom. But I would say increasingly our courts, our legislatures, parliament, the media, the corporate sector are seeing that we need to sort of push religion out of the public square to sort of establish this leveling out where although there's this sort of a feigned diversity, it's a diversity that is only acceptable if you embrace this closed secularism where the state is secular, the public square is secular. And of course, this is really a myth because secularism in that sense is in a sense a faith with its own creeds and its own rituals. There's also an amnesia within our faith institutions, within our congregations, where we ourselves, and I think Christians are the worst offenders in many respects, have privatized our faith. We keep it in the comfortable pew, we keep it in the home. We don't want to go out into the public square. And so in doing that, we rob public debate of our religious beliefs and expressions that can enrich public dialogue. And so we close ourselves off. We embrace sort of a post-Enlightenment understanding that religion, yes, is truly a private matter. But of course, that's not borne out in what we believe in our various religious traditions. And then finally, the other key driver that I think we have to watch in Canada, and I think we're seeing this now increasingly in the United States, is what constitutes reasonable limits on religious freedom. And in the Canadian Constitution, in the 1982 Constitution, Section 1 states that rights and freedoms enumerated in the Charter of Rights are subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So what are those reasonable limits? In the pandemic, we've seen in certain jurisdictions such as British Columbia and Quebec, where even the freedom to worship has been completely lost, where churches, synagogues, mosques, gurdwaras have been shut. This is varied across the country. Different jurisdictions have been more open, such as my own province of Ontario. But we should take a cautionary note from the Canadian experience, and I look forward to discussing it a little bit more in discussion. Thank you very much, and thank you to Notre Dame for this wonderful initiative. I'm very glad to be here, and sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but the border being what it is, here I am.
We'll be up to fly fish with you as soon as the borders open. Don't worry.
Excellent.
I want to thank our panelists for their interventions, the rich amount of information they've shared with us. Unfortunately, we have very little time for questions, so I will reserve my own for the end if no one has any objections. So if you have questions for the panelists, please, and I beg the panelists to keep your remarks as brief as possible so that we don't impede too much on our listeners in their break time. Questions, anyone? Yes, sir.
Yeah, a question for Kelsey. This kind of goes on, but Nathaniel started saying that to the extent that we protect religious liberty domestically impacts how our agents respond internationally. You know, and understanding that religious liberty doesn't necessarily follow political lines, is there a difference between the current administration and the former administration in the way that they're interacting with the UN on some of the religious liberty issues you discussed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. It's a little early to tell, is the short answer. We did host the U.S. diplomat recently who was covering religious freedom at the UN just about a month ago, and she outlined some of the priorities for the current administration, and they were more or less similar to the previous administration's priorities. However, shortly thereafter, she left the UN for a different posting, and there has not been a replacement, as far as I'm aware, to cover the issue of religious freedom at the UN. So it's a bit early to tell.
Any other questions?
Maybe if I could
Please go ahead.
just add to that, there's been a chronic problem both in Democratic and Republican administrations of long gaps between when the ambassador at large for religious freedom position, which is housed at the State Department, which was created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 that I mentioned. It has been worse in Democratic administrations. I mean, there's no reason why it should be. You would hope that both parties, whoever is in the White House, would have an interest in filling this position as quickly as possible. But as of now, it is empty. So there's no person at the ambassadorial level within the State Department, which has to some extent the lead on some of these things, representing us abroad on religious freedom.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for giving this great talk. To all the panel, just to kind of follow on Deacon Andrews' comments, what do you say to those who say that imparting values of religious freedom in the American context, because there is such a different understanding in other parts of the world, as being kind of an encroachment on their values? How do we bring an inherent definition to religious freedom to impart it in other places without sort of interfering with their sovereignty as well?
Stephen, you want to start off?
Well, it's a fair question, and I think it's a question that needs to be asked before we go into these countries. And that's our problem, is that we've gone into these countries and then left this and said, okay, we expect you to modernize and or join the rest of the Western world in this context, but not in that context. It's a completely mixed message, and it ends up disastrously. And I think that the recent historical evidence experience in that part of the world reflects that.
I'll just add to that from the UN perspective. We do have documents that have been agreed upon. So starting with the UDHR, Article 18, and then going to the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 18 really lays out what freedom of religion is. And there have been general comments subsequently that don't necessarily reflect all of the member states. But we have so many countries that have ratified the ICCPR. And so there is a general understanding among the majority of countries in the world as to what it is. And yet we're seeing it kind of be eroded in some ways and ignored in other ways. So I think, we do have some good foundations to point to, but the trajectory isn't looking as good as it could.
I think there has to be also sort of an embracing of humility when we engage other countries. I remember in 2013, I met with very senior Turkish officials about Turkey's religious freedom record, and it's not a great record. And in briefing them and giving my thoughts on how they could address some of the challenges that they face, they said, well, thank you very much, Ambassador. Maybe we can talk to you about Quebec. And I thought, well, touche, that's fair. So when we engage, we have to, again, be very aware of what's happening in our own backyard. And are we upholding religious freedom? Are we being robust in doing so? But also not getting caught into a situation where it becomes a question of apples and oranges. I mean, although the situation in both the United States and Canada, there are certain challenges, compared to countries such as Turkey or Pakistan, we have very robust religious freedom. And so we also need to have the courage to be able to state that. But also to do it with a clear reminder that we don't have a perfect record.
One other thing, if I could just add, I mean, when we promote religious freedom in other countries, we're simply saying that, every human person has the right, as Father Deacon mentioned earlier, of course, to the internal life, to conscience, to live that out at the individual level, at the communal level, and also in the public square. Beyond that, we're not getting into the particulars of one faith or another. And what we often find when we're engaging with foreign governments, with foreign parliaments, et cetera, is that the pushback is coming from people who have an interest in denying all of that, particularly to minority faiths. In general, it is a minority faith that is seeking to deny religious freedom to smaller communities, ranging from the sort of the genocidal end of the spectrum to something which may be maybe not as much a matter of life or death, but certainly relegates people to second-class citizen status.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, I'll rob 2 seconds of your time. Again, just reflecting again in this vein of what to do in a failed state or a totalitarian state. I think of Stephen's work in Iraq. I think of Lebanon. I think of the combination of failed states and of totalitarian states where there are different kinds of oppression on religious freedom, and what the responsibility of the West or how the West can engage in those areas to move the dialogue forward. Stephen, if you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, again, we've heard the word humility be used a couple of times here, and I think that's the key. Be humble enough to understand we don't have the entirety of the truth, and look at these situations honestly for what they are. I don't believe that for the most part, we look at most of these situations honestly because of our lack of humility in hearing from the people actually on the ground. So I think honesty, humility, virtues Christians ought to be able to live with. Yeah.
Yeah, I can say in terms of the work that my team does in some of the countries that I mentioned where the persecution is quite severe, we have 3 criteria when we go on to work in any country. And number 1 is that for my team is that the persecution is severe. Number 2 is that legal remedies are viable. And so in these failed states, that's not the case. And then number 3 is that we have a significant network of attorneys and other actors on the ground, or that we're able to create one to work with and through. But what I will say is other organizations that we partner with who do work in failed states are really focused on the humanitarian efforts, on raising awareness, and on, prayer initiatives. And so we're seeing, we're hearing some good stories from other organizations that aren't focused on legal work, but we have not in any way pursued legal work in those countries.
Yeah, I would just amplify something that Steve said, which is how fundamental it is for the work, particularly of governments and also parliaments and our own Congress in the United States, to be led and driven by what we're hearing from people on the ground. I mean, when I had meetings with senior U.S. officials when I was working at the Helsinki Commission about, why was it that you had Yazidis and Christians that had been deliberately targeted for genocide? Why aren't we systematically and deliberately identifying their needs across the spectrum and responding to them in a corporate level, treating them as groups and not just as individuals? And so I would hear things like, well, if we were to do that, if we were to sort of, direct assistance to them intentionally, we would be putting a target on their back, and we don't want to do that. And my response was always, but we talk with these people, we work with these people, they're begging us for you to provide assistance in that way. Another thing that we'll sometimes hear from U.S. officials is, well, we don't want to speak out about, this particular prisoner or case or religious group or something like that, because that will put them in jeopardy. Are you being told by people in country to be silent? Maybe that's so. And if so, very much, if they've asked you to not say anything, then you really need to take that very seriously. But it's often a pretext. It's often a pretext for not being proactive. So really to do that due diligence, and it is hard in some cases when you don't have an embassy or you don't have a consulate or something like that. But there are ways of tapping into these networks of people to find out what are their needs and how do they think it would be best for you to try and address those needs.
Yeah, I think maybe just one point on that is the importance of really robust and extensive training for Foreign Service personnel, for people that are in advocacy organizations around religious freedom and how to engage religious people, how to develop a vocabulary through which you can communicate with them. Because one of the impacts of our very secular societies, both in the United States and Canada, is that the vast majority of people who are gaining these positions in our foreign services have been formed in a particular way from primary school through secondary school to post-secondary education, where they never speak about religion and they don't know how to speak about religion. And so then we send them into these situations and, we can't really fault them because they don't know how to have a dialogue with religious people because they're not even in that headspace. And so it's very important that we have robust training for diplomats and for people that are engaging in these areas so that they can at least have basic vocabulary and a sense of the way in which these people live out their lives and how faith shapes how they engage. That's crucial.
A warm thank you to all of our panelists for their sharing their information, their expertise, their life experience. Just a reminder to everyone, there's an optional walking tour right now, and the cocktail hour, the most important part of any Catholic function, begins at 6 o'clock. So please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing with us today.